All right. I am super excited to have with us today Dr. Maurenn MacNamara. She's going to introduce herself in a minute and tell us a little bit about herself, and then we're going to be going through a slide presentation with her about animals and trauma that I'm excited about. So Dr. Mac, welcome. It's good to have you with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited to speak with you. Let's see. By way of who I am, I'm an associate professor at App State in the social work department. My social work career started as a result of a program I was involved in as a horse trainer. So I do not have a BSW. I'm one of those MSWs that came into a master's program with an animal behavior and biology bachelor's. And I was training racehorses and training kids that were Olympic hopeful equestrians. And a friend of mine called me and said, oh, there's this cool job where you teach kids to be the grooms for the racetrack. And, you know, you have summers off and, you know, you get vacation and sick time. And I said, well, look at, so I got the job. And the first day on the job, I'm thinking these kids are going to be these highly dedicated kids like my riders. And I told one of the kids to move a wheelbarrow out of the way, and he threw a pitchfork at me, and it stuck in the wall about waist level. And I thought, these are really different than kids. So a friend of mine, thankfully, was a therapist, and I called her and I said, oh my God, this is what's going on. And she went, oh yeah, that's ODD. And I'm like, yes, it is odd. And she goes, no, oppositional defiant disorder. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Started a long conversation, and I knew animal behavior. And I said, well, what that sounds like a 2-year-old colt to me. And she's like, no, it's not. And I'm like, well, I think it is. And so as a way to cope, she suggested I assign the kids to the horses that acted most like them. And this was with the intention of providing kids with immediate consequences. And sure enough, it was fascinating to watch. It was fascinating to work with these kids. You know, at this point, the kids would have all sorts of other labels, but at that time they were called truants, chronic truants, and bad actors and all of that. So by the end of the 2 years, 80% of the kids had jobs, which was unheard of for this crowd. We had 5 of them who had gotten their academic acts together and got into college, into some vocational programs. And it was a real success, and I was hooked. I was like, this is what I want to do. And unfortunately, the program decided that everyone would be very successful if they learned how to use this weird thing called a computer. And they ditched the horse program for a computer program. And I went and talked to some friends, and they said, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to work with clients? And I said, no, I really want to design the programs. And they said, well, you need social work. And that's how I ended up in social work. So long story, but it has helped me, the blending of the two things has really helped me understand what trauma does. Because in working with the animals that I worked with, trauma is a big issue. And animals can't tell you about their trauma. They can only react to you in a trauma experienced way. So a lot of the early research about trauma and impact on the brain had to do with animals. Harlow's monkeys, all sorts of things. And so I was working with a lot of high school, junior high school kids who had a variety of diagnoses, and I was not acting as the therapist, but I was the equine manager. And I understood the connection between the way a trauma brain understands the world around it and responds to the world around it, and how I could help the kids see what the horse was doing. And then the therapist kind of took it from there and said, you know, Johnny, what does this mean for you? And so my work has really been in how trauma is important in terms of families. But then as I was doing this, I started to notice that in violent and chaotic families, and they can be two different things, very violent families, interpersonal violence, or just incredibly chaotic families, there is a link between what's happening to human family members and the animals that share those lives. So let us proceed.
Makes sense. Thank you for sharing that story. I heard bits and pieces of that in class with you, but I don't know if I heard that whole thing beginning to end. And if I did, I didn't remember it. So I appreciate you sharing that with us because it's fascinating. So let me see if I can share my screen.
Okay.
Oh, look, this may work. Okay.
Wow.
Can you see your slides, Dr. Mac?
I can.
Okay.
So next slide.
Next slide. Let me get to where I can. Okay, hold on. I got to move bars and stuff to be able to get to.
Yeah, that's always my challenge with it.
Nope, that makes it bigger. Okay, I'm trying to figure out. Oh, look. Okay, here I go. All right, we're gonna have to scroll.
You got it.
Next
okay,
slide.
So we're kind of, and my introduction is a way of telling it, of talking about the objectives. Just look at these relationships between what's happening to the non-human animals, ACEs and toxic stress, and why it's so important to assess for animal-related traumatic experiences. And I think we're all pretty good about a lot of the ACEs, but the animal ones can be the cap. They could be that final risk factor, okay? And then there's a tool for doing that, the Childhood Trust Survey, and including animals in how you analyze human systems. So next slide. Okay, so as we all know, many of us know, that animals are very important in American households, but also in North Carolina. I think this is now up to 68%, because this quote was in 2012, and so they redid it in 2020, so it's increased. The thing that's important to recognize is that more people in the US have animals than children, and frequently in beginning families, the first kid has 4 legs. And it's also part of how people negotiate relationships in terms of power and autonomy. So when people start dating, what if one has a pet and the other doesn't? How do we accommodate the other? What if they both have pets? And what if the pets don't like each other? So it's how families start to negotiate. And children are more likely, this is an interesting thing too, they're more likely to live in a household with a pet than with a biological parent, second parent, or a sibling. So many children learn empathy and caring and sharing with a 4-legged sibling than with a 2-legged. Okay, next slide. So we've looked at this. The research has looked at pets as family members across racial, ethnic, gender identity, all sorts of different variables. And we don't find statistically significant differences. And they all report this emotional support, love, companionship, and family members, but the way it plays out may look different. Next slide. Okay, so pets can be part of family structure and way into developmental stages. And one thing that's really interesting to keep in mind is pets like dogs and cats live 10 years and 10, 12 years, maybe a little longer, and some might even get to 20. But most dogs and cats, 10 to 15 years, which is about the length of a developmental stage in humans and in human family systems. So we see turnover that sort of echoes where the family is going. So the pet that was there when the initial pair got married or started to live together becomes one of the kids. And then as those kids start to go to school, that pet may die off. And then the decision is, do we do another? And the same thing happens with empty nesters. The kids leave and leave the pets at home as they go off to college or as they go to serve in the military. So think what happens and the significance of those animals when somebody doesn't return. So they can act as replacements for family members. So maybe we don't have a grandma, maybe we don't have siblings. They can also interfere with human dynamics. We know that pets can buffer conflict, but they can also reinforce a family identity. So it's our dogs, and this is a Labrador home, or this is a Golden Retriever home, or we have cats. And we all know of animals that get in the middle of people arguing. And because the animals that we have live in our homes also have natural behaviors of living in a family group. And in family group social structures, you want to keep violence down because we're a family. So dogs and cats are very sensitive to conflict within a family group. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about this. So ethnicity really predicts species and breeds chosen, some care choices, but not intensity. So they may keep animals outside. They may have a particular affinity for one type of animal or another. And we do have different incidences of pet keeping. And Native Americans, this is probably an incorrect statistics because as I've worked with more Indigenous people, I find that they don't refer to animals that live with them as pets. They see them as more equal and more autonomous. But that number is big because any number of Indigenous people have animals around them. And it depends, we think some of the impact of these numbers has to do with poverty and regulations regarding rentals. So pet keeping is harder if you rent rather than own. Next slide. Okay, so here's the problem. We know that they're all involved in our lives. They're significant portions of our lives. The people that keep them are, they're very important to the people that keep them, and yet we don't ask about them. We don't have an agreement about where animals fit. I hear frequently from social workers, but other social service, people that, well, you have to care about people and then you worry about animals. So that's where do they fit in a moral compass. We have conflict over the benefits and challenges. So are you spending money for dog food and yet you and your kids are hungry? Are you spending a lot of money to rent a house so you can keep a dog? Are you staying in a violent relationship because you're worried about placing the cats? So we have an assumption that animals are only important to certain cultures or social classes. And that breaks down as, well, can you afford that dog? Next slide. So we've sort of talked about this, so you can get these slides and have this and look up this research as it goes. But we know that they occur throughout the life course, and they tend to go in and out of the life course as well. You may have times when people that keep pets don't keep them. Find that a lot with students. They get into housing that doesn't allow pets, so the pets stay at home with the family. Next slide. Okay, so they can be protective factors for children and families, because families that have a safe and stable focus tend to have pets that allow kids to get really close to them. Children who have positive friendships and peer networks also tended to have grown up with animals, and families that engage in fun and positive activities together. I think many of us have seen the Subaru commercials with the dogs driving. So it sort of shows, and in fact, Subaru has really exploited this and has a dog package for the car of the extras you can put on your car to accommodate Fido. And in communities where violence is not tolerated or accepted, you see a lot of people hanging out with their pets. Next slide. Did we freeze? Next slide. I think you've frozen, Denise. Uh-oh. We seem to be frozen. Any help? Oh, there we go. She left us. All right.
She did leave us, and it looks like now I'm the host, but I don't have those slides, Dr. Mac.
Okay, well, I'm going to try and bring it up quickly here. I should be able to find it.
And I don't know if she made you co-host or not. Let's see if I can do that. It looks like you are co-host, so you should be able to share slides if you can find them.
I think I got it.
Awesome.
I think so. All right, so let's see here. I know that I have one challenge with this is when I share my slide, then it goes wee-wah. So let's see here.
I'm back. Something blinked in our building and it shut my laptop off. So sorry. Give me 1 second, and now I got the slide and everything ready. Let me just jump back on. I was having a panic attack.
Well, so were we.
I bet so. Okay, here I am, and here's the slide, and now you may resume. My apologies.
No problem. Next slide.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. So in terms, we all know what ACEs are. So witnessing violence in the home or the community can be an ACE. and that includes witnessing violence towards an animal. Families with attitudes accepting of or justifying violence or aggression, that includes families that justify aggression or violence toward an animal. And communities with high levels of social and environmental disorder, that includes stray and dangerous dogs, lots of feral cats that are dangerous to people. So this is how animals now become part of ACEs. Next slide. So some of the risk factors when I start to think about there's animal cruelty or animal abuse going on, it's going to contribute to ACEs, is multiple pets that are lost or disappeared. And the kids will tell you that. Well, I don't know, he went away. And frequently animals and pets are used as a way to keep people quiet. They're threatened with the pets. If you're not careful, that dog, I'm going to kill the dog. If you tell anyone, you'll never see your cat again. Or you see what I did to that dog, you can be next. So, you know, when we have substance abuse, again, that's another indicator. And resident dogs are a big red flag. Now, let me explain the difference between a resident dog and a family dog. A resident dog, and I'm certain most of us have seen this, is a dog on a chain quite a ways from the house where there's no grass, where that chain has been dragged around and around and around. And the chain is large for the size of the dog. It looks like a logging chain. There's often a padlock on it. Any bully type, and I'm not going to name breeds because dogs don't always look like what their breed is, but any of these broad-headed, short-muzzled dogs, and especially if you don't see any signs of food or water. And you don't see an obvious path where people are going out and taking care of that animal. These animals have low socialization and are often at risk for being harmed by people in the household where there may be violence, because people, and especially kids, will go out and act out that violence that they're experiencing on an animal. Again, communities with few community activities for young people. I've been involved in any number of investigations of a group of kids getting together and setting an animal on fire or torturing animals. Children with and youth with few friends and who engage in aggressive or delinquent behavior. So these are all red flags that include animals. Next slide. So in these at-risk families, we know that caseworkers report that children's pets are threatened, injured, killed, or denied care. So people going in to do investigations or visiting a home, teachers may also hear of this. Kids might come to school and tell the teacher that Fluffy ran away. Or Fluffy broke his leg or something like that. And we should always follow up on this. Witnessing and perpetrating animal abuse are predictors of family violence. And so it's, I was talking yesterday with a group of child welfare workers. And I said, what are two incredibly red flags that you have when you go in to visit a home? And they said, guns and drugs. And I said, well, here's what I want you to add to that is guns, drugs, and animals. Because if you see, you know, like guns laying on tables or opened prescription bottles laying around, that's just as dangerous to a kid as an animal cowering under a table, or an animal that is snappish and is very frightened or aggressive. Again, children may redirect that aggression, and shelters have noted quite often that clients' concerns for pets affects their decision to leave. And so they may stay or they may go back because they're really concerned about an animal. In North Carolina, we do have a law that will include pets in orders of protection. Next slide. Okay, so you can do things to talk to kids, and in fact, teachers can do a pet questionnaire as a fun thing to do. So it doesn't single out, but is there a pet in your family? What do you do with the pet? Does the pet participate in holidays? If you're in trouble, what happens to the pet? These last one is for older, for adults or even teenagers. If you had to choose between getting food or medicine for your pet and food or medicine for you, how would you choose? And as the pandemic stretches out and people have limited incomes, many of them are not willing to give up an animal. So you got to pay attention to the significance of species and naming and narratives around pets. Remember, pets never get a chance to tell us the truth. We tell their lives for them. And so it's interesting in how people language about an animal. Next slide. Here's the resident or family dog, so you can see that. Anybody see what is your feeling when you look at this picture?
That child may get bitten.
That's right. Okay, so notice this is a chain that's inappropriately large for the dog, but the dog is in a backward motion, right? Not in a forward motion. And the child is doing two things that are horrible in canine society. And one is making direct eye contact, and a second is holding the muzzle. And I've seen a lot of people look at this picture and go, "Aw," and I'm like, no, run and save the child, run and save the child. But this is the kind of thing I would watch if I went into a family. And when I see something like this, I'm like, okay, it's going to be traumatic for a child to be bitten by a dog. And second of all, why is the parent not safeguarding the child? And I know we have all seen the YouTube and all the other photos and pictures of kids being placed on animals to ride them. Highly dangerous behavior. And when dogs bite, the problem is for small children, they are at eye level. So when they bite, they hit the corner of the eye or the lip. Now in canine culture, when you want to reprimand someone, you bite them in the cheek. That's what dogs do to each other. You bite a lip or you bite a cheek. Unfortunately, human cheeks and lips are not as tough as dog cheeks and lips. Okay, next slide. Okay, so they give us a way to assess boundaries. Are there boundaries? Is the dog, I went into one family's and the dog just took the food from kids, just took it right off their plates. And so the kids had learned to eat by covering their plate, and nobody said, why are we doing this with the dog? So the kids were on their own. Stability and longevity in families where there's a new dog or new pet every 3 to 6 months, something's happening. turnover, enactment. Are people acting out aggression on animals or with animals? People can be used, dogs can be trained to threaten family members. And in fact, we know of a number of cases where a partner told the other partner that the dog was watching them. And if they stepped out of line or let anyone in the house, the dog would attack. Scapegoating. This is one of the things I find very interesting with kids. Often kids, if there's something that's gone wrong, like spilled a glass of milk, they blame it on the pet, which is somewhat okay. But if Sammy got hurt because of a pet, or the pet hurt Sammy, not dad, that might be another consideration. And then perpetration against vulnerable family members. Next slide. Okay. These are some of the things we want to ask. Is animal keeping part of cultural practice and identity, or is it a pattern of violence? So here's an example. You can tell by my last name, I have some links to Ireland. And so I have an Irish wolfhound. It's part of my identity, okay? But I'm not keeping a giant dog because I want her to be able to attack people. Okay, so there's a difference there. Routine care, is the animal target, or is the animal used to target others? How do they explain violence towards an animal? And is there a history of dog bites? So the interesting thing is dog bites have to be reported to public health. So if dog bites, if you notice dog bites on a child or any animal bites and cat scratches, I would check and see if they've been reported to public health, because this is a public health issue. And the interesting thing is that cat bites and scratches don't have to be reported to public health, yet you have a higher incidence of serious infection with cat bites and cat scratches, cat scratch fever, and some other things. So think about that. Next slide. Okay, so this C-Share assesses for animal-related experiences. And that's a hyperlink. And so you can click on that. It will take you right to Barbara Boat is her name, and the Boat Survey of Animal Experience. And it's about 10 questions. And 1 and 2 ask about present and past pet keeping. 3, have they ever had a favorite pet? Now, in some communities, this may be a no. I was talking to some people yesterday who are in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is a very high population of Mennonite and Amish, and they don't have pets. The animals that are there on their property are animals that are working. Question 4 is asking if it was ever a source of comfort or support. What about pets being hurt, something bad happening? 8 and 9 about seeing someone hurt an animal, and 10 ever been badly frightened or hurt by a pet. So again, people can threaten others with animals by bringing them into the house or saying, I'm going to let him loose in your house, or I'm going to let him loose when you're outside and he's going to chase you down. Okay, next slide. Okay, don't assume children will bring up animals if animals are important. They tend to answer what is asked. You got to set aside our own ideas and biases. I met one day with a woman in tears, and I asked her what was wrong, and she said, my pet Joey was killed this morning by the postman. And I'm like, oh my God, tell me what happened. And she said, well, Joey was a tarantula. And I'm like, And apparently Joey was on her shoulder, and she went to the door to get a package, and the mail carrier went, ew, and knocked it off her shoulder. And tarantulas are rather fragile little things, and it killed it. So, we have to, when people say, oh, I have this skink and I love him, I'm like, okay, well, we're a snake. So you have to kind of move beyond that. Take animals at every level of the ecosystem seriously, even in farming communities. We have found serious abuse of animals on farms, and people can justify that and say, well, it's only a dairy cow or whatever. So be careful of that. Get to know those animal related resources in your community and partner with them. So one of the things we were talking to others about yesterday is the trauma for kids going into foster care and having to leave behind a pet. And wondering if there's a way that we can work out some visiting, taking pictures, videos. Could the shelters take in those animals so the kids could visit in the shelter? And these are all sorts of different programs and projects that might be very helpful. And these different organizationals and other regulations related to animals, like get to know the North Carolina laws regarding animals in order of protection. Animal cruelty is a felony in this state. So, and the reason it's become a felony is we understand now that it is linked to other forms of violence. And I think that's the last slide, but let's see. It is. Okay.
I'll share so I can see everybody's faces. I have several comments. One is, I think about the houses I've been to doing home visits where there was like every time I went, there was a different set of animals. A different set of kittens, a different set of cats, different dogs. And I thought it's maybe been like 3 different families in the 28 years I've done this. And that I noticed that, but it never occurred to me to think about what that might mean. And now I'm thinking back and going, oh, but there was never the same group of animals twice.
Yeah.
That was one thought that I had. And then I thought of another thing where I had years and years ago where I made a report because a child said that his dad got mad at him and bit him. And then the dad said that the dog had bitten him, but it was clearly a human bite and not a dog bite.
Yeah.
And I had forgotten about that, but the dad blamed the dog for it.
Uh-huh.
And then the last thing I was going to say, when I've thought a lot about kids and going into foster care and having to leave behind their stuffed animals and their clothes and their parents and their bed and all that, I never thought about them having to leave their pets. And often the pets are like the only source of positive nurturing they feel in their home. And so now they're being taken away from their pets. I'd never thought of that.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
If anyone has any questions or comments, you're welcome to unmute or type something in the chat that I can read to Dr. Mac. Someone said, thank you, that as an animal lover, this was very interesting. I had never thought about any of this, Dr. Mac, until I think it was maybe the conference where you did this the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's fascinating to me to think about this differently. Other comments or questions for Dr. Mac?
Dr. Mac, I work with children birth to 3 with the infant toddler program. And one of the questions that we ask when we're doing an adaptive questionnaire, the DAISY developmental assessment of young children too, one of the questions is, shows care when handling an infant or small animal. Well, I've always known if they squeeze the animal's too tight, it's definitely not a good sign, but this brings that to a whole different level. So now when I'm asking that question, I think I'm going to have some further details to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, and another part of that is does the family take appropriate care and concern? Because kids do really weird things to pets because it takes them a while to figure out it's a living thing. And so if they're not careful, I've seen parents allow a crawler to crawl up to a dog with a bone. And I'm like, oh my God. So that's something to watch too. How do they allow that child to interact? Thank you.
Let's see, another comment was that it's interesting to observe the treatment of pets as an indicator for abuse and trauma. I think this is kind of a novel thing for some of us to be thinking about. And then Candace is telling me that there's a question, Candace, that I don't see. Do you, Candace, if you can see that question, do you mind to read it?
Sure, unless Ashley wants to just ask it herself.
Yeah, I'll just speak up. Hey, I'm Ashley, and I appreciate your presentation. It's very, very informative,
Thank you.
educational. So I read an article recently that about the benefits that pets have on humans. And one of the conclusions in the article was that the benefit to people of having pets was sort of mediated by socioeconomic class. And some of the stuff you're talking about seems related in that maybe some people with fewer resources may not care for their pets as well. And then there may end up being problems where children are being hurt or, some of the dynamics we've talked about. But I was just curious what you thought about that. And I think one of the factors mentioned in the article was, for example, not being allowed to have a pet in an apartment, for example, whereas maybe in a home it is allowed, if so that's sort of a difference in how much income someone has available to them and that kind of thing.
I think that's a really good observation. And this is one of my confounding understandings with my field of social work, is that we tend to look at animals as a privilege, and tend to see it as people of privilege get to have pets, but people who are not of privilege don't. And so I think that's a problem, and it goes to, equity for people. This is part of the rise in the quote emotional support animal. And here's how the law reads. The Fair Housing Act, which was designed to, in regard to Section 8 housing or federally subsidized housing, said that people with a disability and young children should be able to have a pet in spite of no pet leasing. And so Americans are very entrepreneurial, and Americans love titles. So some entrepreneuring people said, I've trained this emotional support animal and you can have it, and then you can have a pet in a no pet housing community. Well, there's a little bit more to that. The challenge is most landlords don't want to take that on for fear that they may be actually discriminating against someone with a disability. But it had to do with opening up Section 8 housing so that people who are poor could still have a pet. And I think one of the things we need to recognize is that poverty may or may not be exacerbated by keeping a pet. A Chihuahua doesn't cost a lot to feed. We have any number of the food pantries are now starting to gather food for pets as well. I think one of the things we have to consider in this might be a project now that App State is doing a vet tech program, is to look at veterinary care because veterinary care is incredibly expensive. However, that said, that can also be managed if we're willing to say people who are living in poverty should be able to have something living with them that gives them compassion and care. And we hear this again and again from elders and people with disabilities that, and all of us who, or many of us who went through the pandemic, at least I walked the dog today. You know, I've talked to any number of people who are struggling with chronic disease. And it's like, the only reason I get up in the morning is because I've got to get the dog out. For me, it's the chickens, you know, this last couple of weeks of intense snow. Here I am trucking through snowbanks because the chicken girls have to get out. But it does, and for people who are in poverty or people struggling, at least this one, I can help that one. It gives me a way to be effective. It gives me a way to provide nurturing and care. And from a mental health perspective, I think these are some of the real advantages of making it so that pet keeping is a choice and not a privilege. I think, so I appreciate your focus on that.
Couple questions or comments from the chat. One was that the information is reinforced, reminded someone about the benefits of therapeutic riding that contain a lot about mutual respect and taking care of the animal and that kind of thing. And then another one said, sometimes a therapist, sometimes I ask about animals and sometimes I don't, but this conversation will help remind me to be more aware. I've never asked, in all the years I've worked with kids, I've never asked. A lot of times they bring it up, but I've never asked about animals. So this definitely will change the way I have conversations with kids.
One thing that's interesting is with the pandemic, I have provided a lot of telehealth, and I also got a pandemic puppy. And so I was meeting with clients, and I work with a lot of children in their, you know, they were in their homes and I was in my home. I had a couple of times when the puppy got away and just ran up the stairs in my upstairs office, you know, but there were a couple of times when I brought the puppy up to show people, and it's amazing the connection you can have with other people just by sharing your pets, you know, and I get to see them, their dog laying on the bed with them, or petting their cat while they're talking to me, and I could show them my dogs as well. And it was like, oh, wow, she's a real person. She has animals,
Right.
She's not just a screen.
Right. And I think that's from all my years in practice, animals seem to be the great equalizer. And I can say, I have a dog, and somebody will say, oh, I keep a cat, and we can, and then all of a sudden we've got an engaging conversation going. And one of the fascinating things is, tell me how you picked out that animal. What drew you to them? Tons of information about, oh, well, you know, my son left for the military, or my son picked him out because he looked like blah, blah, blah. So it can be a real easy way of opening engagement.
There's a comment in the chat from a veteran that says that they had a VA health consult last week, and that one of the questions asked was, do you own a pet?
Yay.
That's good.
You know, this is one of the things we also have to ask when people may be hospitalized for one reason or another. I was out in Jackson County working with one of the mental health hospitals, and they had a terrible incident where a young man was admitted and spent about 2 weeks, and then was sent home, and no one ever checked on the dog, and he came home to a dead dog in the house. And so he's right back in the hospital. But that was one of the things I noticed. Hospitals are sort of starting to ask, do you have any pets at home? But then what are you going to do about that? Because that can add to anxiety and risk. And that might be part of our training to foster care parents, is Sammy has a pet, he's worried about it, maybe you should talk to him about it. And be careful that Sammy might take out his anger and frustration on pets that you have. So we need to understand those dynamics so people aren't surprised.
So we've got a few more minutes. If anybody wants to ask another question or put another comment in the chat as we're wrapping up. Dr. Mac, you've given us so much great information. Anything else that you don't want to make sure that we hear before we leave you hadn't thought to tell us yet?
I think that we tend to focus on children and pets, but I think we need to keep it on our radar for older adults as well. And older adults often get caught in that bind of older animals with increasing medical needs, just as the same way their life is going. And one of the things we're finding is in older adults with older animals, they may be sharing the same diagnosis. And if a veterinarian then says, well, probably you should euthanize, and what does that say to the person? So those are some of the things to keep thinking about, that older adults are as well connected to pets.
One more question, and if anybody does want to say anything to Dr. Mac, if you'll type that in the chat, I will, any thank yous or those type of things, I'll copy and paste all that in an email to her later so she can read it when she has time. But one question that is interesting is, lots of great information. Any information specifically on non-mammalian pets?
Yes. This is where our bias comes in. So who could love a snake? There's this huge movement towards boa constrictors, pythons, those sorts of things. So again, I want to assess whether this is a status symbol or whether this is truly a pet. I told a group my most beloved pet at one point in my childhood was an American chameleon, and I named it Camille, So, and the animal was incredibly important to me. So we are seeing a rise in these pets because of no pet rental agreements. So people decide they can cuddle up to an iguana or a snake or something like that. And so take it for what it is. We don't all like the same food. We don't all like the same conspecifics, as us in animal behavior would call them. So I would just want to, somebody who has a 10-foot python, I would want to be sure that that is a secure cage if they have toddlers. So we have to take it with a little more than how it's presenting, but shouldn't be any difference in attachment if that's who they've chosen.
Makes sense. All right, Dr. Mac, we're going to let you go in case you need a few minutes before your next thing. We so appreciate you coming to talk with us today and sharing all this information. I can tell that some of us, one person said, never thought about how pets fit into the family dynamic or considered that they're protective factors. So we learned a lot. Thank you for your time. It was great to see you. And
thanks for listening.
Thank you for coming. Hope the rest of your day goes well. I'm going to turn off the recording. And then